Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about who we are, identity is such a fundamental concept.
Hmm.
It's that deep sense of self that shapes, well, everything we do, how we see the world, how we interact with it.
Absolutely.
For so long, we've tended to think of identity, especially during those dynamic adolescent years, as this grand discovery, you know?
Yeah, like you find a label and that's it.
Exactly. A fixed label you eventually find and then stick with forever. But when we add sexual to it, things can get really complex really fast.
Oh, definitely.
And it turns out the way we've often conceived of sexual identity might be a little outdated, particularly when we look at today's youth.
It's truly fascinating to observe how our understanding of identity, and specifically sexual identity, is in a constant state of flux, especially as younger generations redefine what it means to be themselves.
Right.
This deep dive will really challenge some long-held assumptions we might carry about how identity develops, offering a much more nuanced and dynamic view than, simple checkboxes or predefined paths. We're going to explore beyond those simplistic labels to understand the intricate tapestry of self-understanding that young people are weaving for themselves.
That's precisely what we're aiming for. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be diving in.
Today, we're taking a truly captivating plunge into the world of sexual identity development among youth. Our journey is guided by a robust, in-depth academic chapter from a renowned Handbook of Identity Theory and Research.
Yeah, a really solid source.
That gives us a rich, research-backed foundation to understand how young people understand their sexuality in this, well, rapidly changing world.
And for you, as someone with a strong interest in elementary education and maybe a budding curiosity in psychology, our mission today is to thoroughly unpack these insights. We'll spend time exploring the crucial, nuanced distinctions between different terms related to sexuality that are often confused. Really get that clear.
Yes, definitely need that.
We'll then critically evaluate some of the established traditional models of identity development that have historically guided our thinking.
And see where they maybe fall short.
Exactly. And perhaps most excitingly, we'll delve into new, cutting-edge perspectives that fundamentally challenge those older assumptions.
That's right. Our goal isn't just to present abstract theory, though.
No, not at all.
We're aiming to connect these complex psychological ideas directly to the real lived experiences of young people you might encounter.
Right, making it practical.
And, where possible, we'll offer insights that are immediately relevant to the classroom. This is about giving you the practical tools and a deeper understanding to navigate and support the evolving landscape of identity for the young people you might interact with every single day.
Let's do it.
Let's get started on this exploration. Before we dive into the theories and the newer ways of thinking, it feels absolutely essential that we get our vocabulary straight.
Oh, yes. Crucial first step.
This source makes some truly vital distinctions between terms that, frankly, many of us, and I include myself in this, often use interchangeably without realizing their precise meanings.
It happens all the time. Easy mistake to make.
So let's begin with the basics. What exactly do we mean when we say sexual identity versus, say, sexual orientation label, or even sexual orientation itself?
Yeah.
They sound incredibly similar, but the source makes it clear they are fundamentally distinct concepts.
You've hit on an excellent starting point, because misunderstanding these terms is a root cause of so much confusion and miscommunication, in public discourse and even in research.
Right. Yeah.
Let's really break them down. First, let's define sexual identity. The source meticulously defines this as the name and the profound meaning individuals assign to themselves.
Okay, the name and the meaning.
Exactly. This self-assignment is based on the most salient or prominent sexual aspects of their life. Think of it as an individual's personal narrative of their sexuality.
Their own story.
Precisely. This includes a wide array of elements: their attractions, their fantasies, their desires, their actual sexual behaviors, and the nature of their relationships.
So a whole constellation of things.
Yes. Crucially, sexual identity is about how an individual internally gives meaning and significance to their own feelings, their perceptions, and their cognitions about their sexuality. It's an ongoing, deeply internal process of self-definition.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, it's something deeply personal, an internal construct that is truly self-ascribed rather than something someone else could or should assign to you based on external observations.
Precisely. You've hit on a core characteristic. It's fundamentally self-ascribed and, for the most part, a conscious process.
Conscious, okay.
It's about what an individual chooses to call themselves, how they understand and name their own experience. What's particularly insightful is that an individual's sexual identity can prioritize certain aspects over others.
How so?
For instance, someone might base their identity primarily on their romantic attractions, even if their sexual behaviors or fantasies might, diverge slightly from that.
Okay, so they pick what feels most central to them.
Right. The source even touches on a more complex layer, noting that sexual identity can sometimes involve a conscious or unconscious attempt to deceive oneself or others.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it highlights its deeply personal and sometimes protective nature, reflecting the social context people navigate.
That's a powerful point, especially for you, the elementary educator listening.
Mm,
If you're in a classroom, understanding that identity is self-assigned means that you absolutely need to respect how a child or a teenager labels themselves.
absolutely crucial.
It underscores the importance of listening to their voice rather than trying to impose a label on them based on what you might observe in their friendships or their interests or what you simply assume about them.
Hmm.
Their internal experience and their self-chosen label are paramount, and trying to force a label can be incredibly invalidating.
So true. Now let's move to the second term, sexual orientation label.
Okay.
The source occasionally refers to this as sexual orientation identity, but the author actually prefers label for two very good reasons. First, using label helps to reduce confusion with the broader, more inclusive concept of sexual identity we just discussed. Keeps them distinct.
Makes sense.
Second, using identity in this context can feel a bit too presumptuous, implying a deeper, more personal commitment than is intended when simply describing a predisposition.
Okay. So label is more descriptive, less loaded.
Exactly. So a sexual orientation label is simply the term applied to one's predisposition. Think of the more common, broad categories we hear. Heterosexual, mostly heterosexual, bisexual, mostly homosexual, or homosexual.
Right, the standard check boxes.
Those are descriptive terms for a pattern of attraction, not necessarily a deeply ingrained self-constructed identity.
I see. So if a school survey asks about a student's sexual orientation, they're likely asking for this label, which describes a predisposition.
Probably, yes.
But that still doesn't capture the full, complex picture of their sexual identity, does it?
Not at all.
It's a snapshot of a tendency, not the whole evolving story of who they are. For an elementary teacher, this is key because it means that even if a student marks heterosexual on a survey, their internal world of identity might be far more complex than that single label suggests.
Precisely. It's a useful descriptive term for collecting population data or understanding broad demographics, but it doesn't give you the full depth of someone's internal evolving identity.
Right.
Now, for the third term, which is perhaps the one most commonly misunderstood, sexual orientation.
Okay, the big one.
This is defined as a deeply rooted predisposition toward erotic or sexual fantasies, thoughts, affiliations, affection, or bonding.
A predisposition, okay.
This predisposition can be toward members of one's own sex, the other sex, both, or neither, as in the case of asexuality. It's about the fundamental direction of one's attraction.
So this sounds like the core underlying attraction or inclination, the foundational who I'm drawn to piece.
It absolutely is. A key characteristic here, and one the source emphasizes, is that it's generally understood as not alterable.
Not alterable.
Generally, yes. This is often attributed to genetic or prenatal environmental factors. Very few individuals state that they consciously chose their sexual orientation. While an individual's awareness of their sexual orientation can fluctuate, especially during the often exploratory period of adolescence.
Right, when things feel less certain.
Exactly. But the underlying predisposition itself is generally seen as fixed and enduring. It's like having a natural inclination towards a certain type of music. You didn't choose it, it just resonates with you.
That's a great analogy. This distinction, then, between the fixed nature of orientation and the potentially fluid nature of identity or labels is incredibly vital for educators.
Absolutely vital.
It highlights that a student's core attraction, that deeply rooted predisposition, might be stable and unchosen, perhaps a fundamental part of who they are, even if their identity label shifts as they explore. This understanding fundamentally reorients how you view their journey, moving from a rigid expectation of confusion to one of exploration.
Yes. It's about supporting exploration.
It's key to fostering genuine empathy and dismantling judgmental attitudes in your classroom, paving the way for a truly accepting and inclusive environment. It means you're supporting a journey, not just trying to categorize.
That's a perfect summary of its practical application.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the big problem that this source continually circles back to, the conflation of these terms.
Right, mixing them all up.
The author strongly emphasizes that these three distinct concepts, Sexual identity, sexual orientation label, and sexual orientation
Mm-hmm.
are far too often mistaken for each other.
Uh,
This pervasive conflation leads to significant misunderstandings, internal confusion for individuals, and often heated public debates that miss the true nuances of human sexuality.
this is where it gets really interesting, especially for someone thinking about teaching and observing young people.
Yes, the examples are powerful.
The source provides a couple of truly powerful real-world examples that illustrate this conflation perfectly. Imagine a young woman, for instance, who is primarily attracted to other females.
Mhm.
She might engage in sexual activity with both sexes. And yet, when it comes to romantic love, she finds herself falling for males.
Complex picture.
Based on all that, you, observing from the outside, might be tempted to put a neat little label on her.
Yeah, you'd probably try to categorize her somehow.
But the source says she might label her sexual orientation as mostly heterosexual and yet identify sexually as straight. That's a lot to process.
It certainly is. Or consider this other example. A young man who reports attractions to both sexes, but he hasn't engaged in any sexual activity to date.
Okay.
Furthermore, when it comes to romantic relationships, he exclusively loves females.
So you'd think, maybe straight or biromantic?
You might instinctively expect him to identify as bisexual given his stated attractions.
Mhm.
However, the source tells us he might actually label his sexual orientation as bisexual, but then identify his sexuality as gay.
Whoa, okay. That really highlights the disconnect.
These examples truly demonstrate the complex interplay, or sometimes disconnect, between attraction, behavior, and self-identity.
So for you, in the classroom, think about those examples. If you're a teacher, seeing a student act in one way, maybe they have crushes on boys, but they also mention a strong platonic bond with a girl that hints at something more.
Mm-hmm.
Or they talk about one kind of attraction, you might be tempted to put a neat little label on them. Oh, this student must be X or Y or Z.
It's a natural impulse.
But these examples from the research show us just how much fluidity, how much complexity, and how much internal nuance exists beyond what you observe or even what they might initially say.
Exactly.
What you see externally might not align at all with their internal self-perception or even the label they choose to use in different contexts.
This raises an important question for everyone, but especially for an elementary education major. How often do we, as adults, or even young people themselves, truly differentiate between these concepts in everyday conversation?
Probably not often enough.
Realizing that these profound nuances exist in academic research means approaching children and adolescents with a heightened sense of attentiveness to their individuality and their internal experience as they grow.
Uh-huh.
It's about letting go of the urge to rely on external cues or societal stereotypes to define them. It's about listening deeply to them, not just categorizing them.
For a very long time, researchers were intent on charting how people became gay or lesbian.
Yeah, that was the focus.
It was often framed as a progression, a journey through predictable pathways, almost like a series of checkpoints.
Like a developmental ladder.
Exactly. And within this framework, one model in particular stood out above the rest. Cass's model. So what was this model trying to explain, and how did it fit into the broader historical context of identity research?
That's a crucial next step in understanding how our thinking has evolved. Sexual identity models are actually a relatively recent development in psychology, largely emerging in the 1960s and 70s.
So not that long ago, really.
Not in the grand scheme. What's historically significant and quite telling is that these models initially focused exclusively on non-heterosexual youth.
Right, heterosexuality was just assumed.
Exactly. It simply wasn't viewed as having an identity that needed to develop. It was considered the normative default state. These early frameworks were often termed coming out models, attempting to chart a linear process from an initial recognition of non-heterosexual feelings to self-identification and eventually to public disclosure. They really tried to put a clear path onto what is often a very messy, individualized experience.
And it seems a lot of these foundational models were built on the earlier work of Erik Erikson, right?
They were heavily influenced by him.
Which, given what we know now, presents some pretty significant, even problematic issues from the outset.
Absolutely. The vast majority of these early sexual identity models were indeed derived from Erikson's seminal 1968 work on identity development, which was hugely influential at the time.
But problematic how?
And here's where the historical bias becomes problematic. Erikson, operating within the prevailing societal views of his era, inherently assumed a direct link between positive identity formation and heterosexuality.
Ah, okay. He saw being straight as the healthy outcome.
Explicitly.
Yeah.
He saw heterosexuality as an inevitable and healthy part of healthy identity development. Critics like Eliason, Gilligan, and Moore and Rosenthal have since highlighted how deeply ingrained this heteronormative assumption was in his foundational theories.
So in essence, he didn't just overlook non-heterosexual identities. He essentially pathologized them from the start, positioned them as something other than healthy or normal.
Precisely. According to Erikson's framework, a homosexual identity was often conceptualized as a rebellion against parental values or as a negative, desperate attempt for an individual to regain mastery and equilibrium when perceived paths toward a positive, presumably heterosexual identity were deemed unattainable.
Wow. That's
This inherent assumption that heterosexuality was the default and the ideal deeply influenced early identity research and, unfortunately, colored how these identities were understood and even treated for decades.
This historical context is incredibly vital for you, the elementary education major.
So important to grasp.
It starkly illustrates how deeply ingrained heteronormativity that is, the pervasive assumption that heterosexuality is the default, normal, or even superior sexual orientation has been within psychological theories themselves.
Right, baked into the foundations.
Acknowledging this historical bias helps teachers understand why past educational approaches might have overlooked, misunderstood, or even actively pathologized non-heterosexual identities. And critically, it helps you actively work against those outdated and potentially harmful assumptions in your own classroom practices today, ensuring you create a truly inclusive space for all students.
Now let's look at what became the standard bearer of these early models. Cass's homosexual identity formation, HIF model, first proposed in 1979.
The famous one.
It gained significant traction and is unique because it's been continuously refined over the years. To the source author's knowledge, it's also the only one of these early-stage models that was subjected to repeated empirical verification.
Okay, so it was tested.
Yes, even generating its own assessment tool, the Gay Identity Questionnaire, to measure progress through its stages.
So what were these famous 6 stages that Cass proposed, and how did they supposedly chart this journey of identity for gay and lesbian individuals?
Cass's model describes what was believed to be a sequential progression. While it's important to remember the significant critiques we'll discuss,
There are caveats coming.
understanding the framework helps us grasp the evolution of thinking. Briefly, the 6 stages are: first, identity confusion.
Confusion, okay.
This is the initial stage where individuals begin to recognize that their sexual feelings, actions, or thoughts could potentially be homosexual. However, they're not yet prepared to fully accept or internalize that possibility.
So like an am I feeling.
Exactly. It's often characterized by internal turmoil, emotional tension, a sense of bewilderment, and considerable anxiety. Imagine a young person feeling a pull they don't understand, or feeling different without a name for it.
Got it. Stage 2.
Second, identity comparison. Here, individuals start to consciously compare their emerging feelings and attractions with those of others around them.
Comparing themselves.
They might tentatively accept that they might indeed be gay or lesbian. This stage involves a complex evaluation. Is this possibility desirable? Is it part of my true self or just a phase? Or is it too costly, potentially leading to social isolation or alienation from family and friends?
Weighing the options, the potential costs.
Right. The source notes that sometimes bisexuality was seen as a special case in this stage, a temporary stop before settling on a singular identity.
Interesting side note. Okay, stage 3.
Third, identity tolerance. In this stage, that tentative belief from identity comparison typically becomes a near certainty that they are likely gay or lesbian. However, it's still not full, comfortable acceptance.
So I probably am, but I'm not okay with it yet.
Kind of. Individuals begin to explore how this identity might affect other aspects of their self, venturing out to make initial contacts with others who share similar experiences, and often informing 1 or 2 trusted individuals about their burgeoning identity.
Testing the waters.
Exactly. It's about dipping a toe in the water, finding initial support, and testing the waters of disclosure. Fourth, identity acceptance.
Acceptance. Sounds positive.
With this stage, individuals are said to gain a clearer, much more positive and affirmed image of themselves as lesbian or gay. They experience greater internal comfort with this identity,
Okay.
which often leads to more selective disclosures to friends and family. However, even at this stage, passing as straight might still occur in certain specific circumstances.
Ah, so not fully out everywhere.
Right. Maybe around less accepting family members like grandparents, or in environments where the social cost of full disclosure feels too high, like a sports team. It's a comfortable internal acceptance, but with strategic external management.
Makes sense. Number 5.
Fifth, identity pride. This stage is often characterized by a strong sense of group solidarity and an in-group versus out-group dynamic.
Us versus them.
A bit, yeah. Individuals may feel a significant degree of anger or frustration with heterosexism, the systemic assumption and privilege of heterosexuality, and might actively prefer associations with like-minded people within the LGBTQ+ community.
Finding community, pushing back.
Yes. This confrontation with broader societal norms helps to solidify and engender a strong public sense of pride in their sexual identity. They're often more outwardly activist or community-focused.
Okay. And the final stage.
And finally, the sixth stage, identity synthesis. This is depicted as the ultimate stage, where individuals fully integrate their sense of self as a sexual minority with all other aspects of their broader self, their career, their hobbies, their family roles, their cultural background.
Bringing it all together.
Exactly. Being lesbian or gay is important, but it's no longer the exclusive or defining aspect of their identity. They feel at peace, self-actualized, less defensive, and are able to engage in positive, authentic interactions with heterosexual individuals, seeing commonalities rather than just differences.
It sounds incredibly neat and linear, almost like a checklist for personal growth.
Doesn't it? A bit too neat, perhaps.
And while we're about to delve into its critiques, understanding these stages can still offer a basic framework for thinking about self-discovery.
True, it provides some concepts.
As a teacher, you might observe a student becoming more comfortable in their skin or beginning to seek out similar peers in school clubs, which could parallel aspects of stages like identity tolerance or acceptance.
You might see echoes of it.
However, it's incredibly crucial not to view these as mandated or strictly linear steps, as if every child must tick off boxes in order or that one stage is inherently better than another.
You've hit on the critical caveat there.
Yeah.
That's the perfect segue into the significant critiques of sexual identity models, especially Cass's, which was so influential.
Okay, let's hear the problems.
The most fundamental criticism is that they present sexual identity from an essentialist perspective.
Essentialist.
By essentialist, we mean they imply that identity is a series of discrete, universalized stages that everyone moves through uniformly, regardless of their individual life context, culture, or personal journey.
One size fits all?
Pretty much. The source powerfully states that stage boundaries inherently place brackets around something that is difficult to bracket, suggesting that real-life identity formation is far messier and more fluid than these models allow. Identity development is also profoundly socially constructed, meaning it's shaped by one's interactions and environment and highly variable from person to person.
And this isn't just a theoretical philosophical critique, is it? The source goes on to say there's a distinct lack of empirical support for these stages actually occurring in the neatly defined, sequential way they were proposed in real life.
That's the kicker.
That's a big deal for a model that was supposedly verified.
It's a huge deal. The source states quite clearly, with empirical backing, that there is no empirical evidence to suggest that sexual identity development occurs in stages, in the way Cass proposed.
Wow, no evidence.
Subsequent studies that specifically tried to verify Cass's model, including follow-up work by Cass herself in 1984, and later research by Brady and Buss in 1994, and Halpin and Allen in 2004, all yielded remarkably similar results.
And what did they find?
What they found was that most subjects they were able to study were already in the later stages, like identity acceptance or identity synthesis.
So they missed the beginning.
Exactly. This made it virtually impossible to actually observe any progression through the initial earlier stages.
So researchers couldn't actually see people moving through identity confusion or identity comparison. They were already past them by the time they were studied.
Pretty much, yeah.
It's like trying to observe a tadpole become a frog, but you can only ever find full-grown frogs.
Exactly. The evidence simply wasn't there to support a linear, stage-by-stage progression. Cass herself, reflecting on her own findings, conceded that her research in no way provides evidence for the concept of progress through all 6 stages.
Even Cass admitted it didn't quite work.
Right. In fact, she suggested her 6 stages could effectively be reduced to 4, largely due to the sheer difficulty of recruiting individuals who were genuinely in those first 3 stages.
Okay, simplification.
Other researchers like Brady and Buss further reduced it to a 2-stage process. essentially, an unintegrated identity versus a fully integrated one. Horowitz and Newcomb, in 2001, also found that major identity models could be broadly reduced to just 4 common themes: self-awareness, self-acceptance, disclosure, and integration.
Fewer, broader themes.
Right. The source even proposes an even more parsimonious 3-stage model: pre-awareness, awareness, and post-awareness.
And studying that very first pre-awareness stage sounds incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to do without bias.
It truly is. It's inherently challenging to recruit individuals who aren't yet aware they're even in a process of identity formation.
How can you study something people don't know they're experiencing?
Exactly. Any knowledge we gain about this pre-awareness phase is almost always retrospective, meaning it's recalled later, which can be significantly distorted by subsequent experiences.
Right. Memory isn't perfect.
Individuals might remember their initial stages as more traumatic or dramatic than they actually were, perhaps to fit a cultural script that expects such ordeals, or to gain sympathy or understanding from others.
Ah, the narrative we tell ourselves later.
Precisely. The source even provocatively suggests that awareness and post-awareness might not be stages at all, but rather choices individuals make about how much to engage with or disclose their sexuality, reflecting their personality and their social environment.
Choices, not inevitable stages. That's a big shift.
It's a very big shift.
This critique is, for an elementary education major, perhaps the most important takeaway from this entire section.
I'd agree. It's fundamental.
It fundamentally teaches us that development, especially identity development, is not linear, universal, or neatly staged.
Not at all.
Students' experiences will be incredibly diverse, often unpredictable, and heavily influenced by their unique social and cultural contexts. As a teacher, this means you shouldn't expect students to fit a predefined mold or to progress in a specific expected way.
Forget the mold.
It strongly encourages observation, empathy, and flexible support rather than rigid expectations or trying to identify which stage a student is in, which could lead to misjudgment or pressure.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
It shifts us away from a potentially diagnostic or prescriptive approach to a much more understanding, supportive, and open-ended one, which is far more beneficial for nurturing young people's healthy development.
So, if the old stage models aren't really holding up to empirical scrutiny, and they certainly don't seem to capture the dynamic reality of young people's experiences today,
Which they don't.
what's a more accurate, more nuanced way to understand how young people develop their sexual identity? This deep dive offers a compelling and intriguing alternative, the differential developmental trajectories framework.
Yes, this framework, proposed by Sabin Williams in 1998 and later refined in 2001, represents a much-needed alternative to the rigid stage models.
Differential developmental trajectories. Let's break that down.
Okay, let's break down its name because each word is significant. Differential refers to the inherent variability and vast diversity that exists both within and across different sexual domains and, crucially, among individuals themselves.
So lots of variation.
Exactly. Developmental signifies that we're looking at sexual milestones and processes that unfold throughout the entire life course, not just a brief adolescent period.
Lifelong perspective.
Right. And trajectories indicates the multitude of individual pathways that unfold across time, recognizing that there isn't one single predetermined route.
Many different paths.
Precisely. It's an interactive approach, meaning it thoughtfully recognizes and incorporates both essentialist factors, like potential biological predispositions, and social constructionist influences, like cultural norms and societal expectations. It's a holistic perspective.
That makes a lot of sense, acknowledging both the internal predispositions and the external shaping factors. So what are the 4 basic tenets that form the foundation of this more dynamic framework?
The first tenet is a foundational one, often overlooked by previous overly specialized research. Same-sex-oriented youth are profoundly similar to all other adolescents in their developmental trajectories.
Similar. How so?
This means that young people who experience same-sex attractions are subject to the same biological, psychological, and social influences that affect all other young people, regardless of their sexuality.
Okay, so they're teens first.
Exactly. The significant danger, as the source points out, is that by exclusively focusing on homoeroticism or difference, we risk misattributing completely normal adolescent experiences, like questioning, changing friendships, or mood swings to their sexual orientation.
I see.
When in fact, they're just being typical teens navigating the universal challenges of growing up.
This is a powerful and liberating message for educators.
It really is.
It's a reminder that, first and foremost, these are adolescents. They share common developmental needs, common challenges, and common strength with all other students in your classroom.
Mm-hmm.
This tenet strongly encourages treating students as individuals first, seeing their full humanity, not primarily defining them by their sexual orientation. It fosters a sense of universal childhood and adolescence within the classroom.
Well said.
For example, if a student is struggling with self-esteem, the first assumption shouldn't be it's because they're gay, but rather, what are the general adolescent factors at play here, and what support does any teen need?
Exactly. The source offers compelling empirical evidence for this, highlighting that there are no sexual orientation differences in many fundamental areas like pubertal onset, overall self-esteem levels, ethnic diversity, or gender socialization.
So the data backs up the similarity.
Yes. While there are important caveats regarding areas like suicide attempts, which often involve specific societal pressures, the overall picture emphasizes profound commonality in core developmental processes.
Okay. What's the second tenet, then? Does it acknowledge any unique differences?
It does, and it introduces an important counterbalance. The second tenet is that same-sex-oriented youth are also dissimilar from other sex-oriented adolescents in their developmental trajectories in some key ways.
Okay, so they are different in some respects.
While they share many fundamental commonalities, they also navigate unique challenges and experiences that set them apart. This dissimilarity might be due to a unique biologically mediated constitution, for instance, a brain organized in a sex-atypical manner, which is a more essentialist view.
Biology playing a role.
Or, more commonly, and from a social constructionist perspective,
Yeah.
this dissimilarity is due to the pervasive cultural heterocentrism and deeply embedded sexual prejudice they encounter.
Ah, the societal pressures.
Exactly. This is particularly true when they display gender-atypical behavior, temperament, or interests, which can draw negative attention and discrimination.
So, while emphasizing the universal adolescent experience, this tenet importantly acknowledges the unique challenges and adverse experiences sexual minority youth might face due to ingrained societal prejudice and lack of acceptance.
Correct.
For you, the teacher, this means being keenly aware of these additional hurdles. It highlights your role in actively fostering truly inclusive, welcoming environments to mitigate these negative impacts and provide equitable support for all students, recognizing that some students face additional unnecessary burdens simply because of who they are.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Moving to the third tenet, which emphasizes the diversity within the group. Same-sex-oriented youth vary immensely among themselves in their developmental trajectories.
We're not a monolith.
Definitely not. Just like other sex-oriented teens, sexual minority youth are not a monolithic group with identical experiences. Influences like gender, ethnicity, geography, socioeconomic status, and historical cohort all combine to create distinctive and highly individualized pathways.
Right, intersectionality.
Exactly. It would be imprudent, the source argues, to characterize same-sex desire as a single, uniform entity with similar developmental trajectories and outcomes for everyone. The experience of a young black lesbian in a rural community, for example, might be vastly different from a white gay man in a major city.
This again powerfully reinforces the absolute need for individualized approaches in the classroom.
Crucial point.
Not all LGBTQ+ students have the same experiences, the same needs, or the same developmental paths. A teacher committed to diversity and equity understands that intersectionality, the interconnected nature of social categorizations like race, class, gender, and sexual orientation, as they apply to a given individual or group, creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage plays a huge role here. You must be prepared to see each student in their full, complex identity.
Absolutely. And finally, the fourth tenet, which brings us back to the ultimate level of individuality. Same-sex-oriented youth follow their own unique developmental trajectories, dissimilar to any other person who has ever lived.
Wow. Each one truly unique.
This is the culmination of the framework's philosophy. Given the profound diversity inherent in individual lives, the general descriptions of group mean differences and similarities, while useful for research,
Right, research needs patterns.
may simply be irrelevant or insufficient when applied to a specific living individual you encounter in your classroom.
This truly feels like the ultimate call for personalized understanding and support.
It really is.
Every student's journey, regardless of their sexual orientation, is unique. As a teacher, this means listening deeply to individual stories, paying attention to their unique expressions of identity, and responding to their needs, rather than trying to apply generalized models or fit them into neat, predefined boxes.
Exactly.
This differential developmental trajectories framework truly embraces the inherent complexity of human development. For you, working with young minds, it fundamentally shifts the focus from trying to diagnose where a child is on a rigid, universal path
Which is what the old models did.
to genuinely understanding and supporting their unique unfolding journey, recognizing their shared human commonalities while thoughtfully acknowledging their specific challenges.
It truly encourages a mindset of continuous learning, empathy, and adaptation as an educator, rather than relying on outdated or overly simplistic frameworks. It's about building relationships based on authentic understanding.
Okay, this next part of our deep dive throws another fascinating curveball.
Oh, what's this?
We've spent a lot of time talking about sexual minority identity and how it develops, but what about straight identity? Does that even exist in the same way? Or is it something entirely different?
Ah, yes. The invisible identity.
The source really delves into this intriguing paradox.
It's a genuinely fascinating area precisely because it's so often overlooked. The core of this issue lies in what the source calls the paradox of heterosexuality.
Paradox.
By virtue of possessing the normative or dominant sexuality in most societies, heterosexual individuals are conferred significant sexual privilege. This privilege, ironically, often prevents any thoughtful or empirical consideration of a straight sexual identity.
Because it's just normal.
Exactly. Heterosexuality is so hyper-normalized in mainstream North America, meaning it's assumed as the default, the unseen norm, that it historically receives minimal attention or research focus compared to same-sex attractions, which are always framed as deviations from the norm.
So it's almost invisible because it's the default, the assumed norm. It's like how a fish doesn't realize it's in water.
Exactly. As Frankel, a prominent researcher in this area, so pointedly concluded in 2003, this is the paradox of heterosexuality. It is ubiquitous as an orientation, yet invisible as a sexual identity.
Wow. Ubiquitous yet invisible.
To truly constitute a straight sexual identity, according to the source's definition, would require conscious thought and active engagement about one's heterosexual orientation and its everyday meaning in their life.
So thinking about being straight.
Yes. It would involve integrating heterosexuality into one's personal and social life in a way that genuinely affects their self-concept, their relationships, and their understanding of themselves. It would be a self-defined identity, not just a given.
But the research, as you just mentioned, often doesn't actually measure this deeper, conscious, straight identity, does it?
No, it generally doesn't.
It continues to conflate terms, even in studies specifically designed to look at heterosexual identity.
Precisely. The typical empirical procedure used to investigate straight sexual identity, unfortunately, assesses not an actual self-ascribed sexual identity, but rather a sexual orientation label.
Back to the labels again.
And then critically, the resulting categorization is often mislabeled sexual identity in the research findings. For instance, the source points to a study by Koenig and Stewart in 2004,
Okay.
where nearly 400 undergraduates were simply asked, how would you identify your sexual orientation? Their responses, including heterosexual, were then treated as indicators of their sexual identity.
But it was just a label they picked.
Right. Yet the source notes that a fair number of these heterosexually identified youth also reported having bisexual attractions, fantasies, and behaviors, but the study didn't explore how these inconsistencies affected their identity as a self-concept.
Or another example from Boratov in 2006, where heterosexual identity was defined simply as someone who is interested in members of the other sex.
That's purely asking about attraction.
Right, not a deeper integrated identity. It feels like they're just swapping labels without really digging into the personal meaning.
And in a similar vein, Morgan, Steiner, and Thompson in 2010 asked participants, when you think about your sexual orientation, what term do you most identify with? Again, this is assessing a preferred label, not necessarily the active internal process of identity formation or integration into one's self-concept. The source makes it abundantly clear that all three of these foundational studies, despite their aims, primarily assess sexual orientation label, not the complex construct of sexual identity as defined at the start of our deep dive.
So, given these methodological limitations, what have researchers managed to find when they try to get at heterosexual identity development? Even with the conflation, what patterns emerge?
The findings, despite the challenges, are quite telling and consistent. in a qualitative study by Eliason in 1995 with heterosexual college students.
Okay.
The most common themes that emerged when asked about their sexual identity were revealingly simple. Outside forces made me heterosexual, and perhaps most strikingly, never thought about it.
Never thought about it.
Yeah. One participant even stated, "The question of how my sexual identity formed really left me stumped. It wasn't about an inborn, fixed identity, nor a consciously chosen one, but simply an unexamined default."
That's incredibly fascinating. They didn't feel they had an identity in the same way we've been discussing it for sexual minorities, who often have to actively claim and define their identity against a heteronormative backdrop.
Exactly.
For straight individuals, it seems to just be.
And further supporting this idea, Frankel, in 2003 and 2004, conducted a Who Am I exercise, where young men were asked to list their most defining characteristics. Less than 10% spontaneously mentioned their sexual identity or even their sexual orientation among their top 15 characteristics.
Wow, not even in the top 15 for most.
Suggests it simply wasn't a salient aspect of their self-concept. Even when Morgan and Associates in 2010 found that over half of heterosexually oriented college men had questioned their heterosexuality at some point.
They had questioned it.
Over half, yes. But what differentiated these questioners from others wasn't a deeper identity exploration, but rather higher affiliations with sexual minorities and a general openness.
So knowing people or being open mattered more than internal exploration.
It seems so.
This all seems very consistent with Marcia's identity statuses, doesn't it? For those unfamiliar, Marcia built on Erickson's work to describe different ways individuals approach identity.
Yes, it fits well.
Heterosexual youth often exhibit an identity-diffused status, meaning they have no active sense of their sexual identity, showing neither exploration nor commitment.
Right, just drifting.
Or they might show identity foreclosure, where they accept an identity imposed by others or by society without any critical self-reflection or personal exploration.
Exactly. The source notes that straight young people generally haven't been known to come out to themselves or others as straight identified.
You don't hear, "I'm coming out as straight."
No, you don't. They don't suddenly wake up and declare, "Wow, I'm a heterosexual." This powerfully highlights the unmarked nature of heterosexuality.
Unmarked.
Because it's the presumed norm, heterosexual youth generally assume they have a normal sexuality, not that they have a straight identity. The identity just exists by default, requiring no conscious articulation or struggle.
So it's not just that they haven't been asked about their straight identity in research, it's that for many, it's simply the default.
It seems that way.
They don't have to think about it or define it or explore it because society just assumes it for them. It's a huge privilege, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
The very lack of need to explore or label is a direct result of being the societal norm, and that has profound implications.
This raises an important question for you, the elementary education major. What does it mean for a classroom environment when the dominant identity, heterosexuality, is largely unexamined and completely normalized?
Right. What does that do to the classroom?
This insight is crucial. It means recognizing that the neutral or normal classroom setting is often implicitly a heteronormative one. This implicit assumption can subtly make other identities feel othered or completely invisible, creating a less welcoming space for sexual minority youth.
Making them feel like the exception.
Exactly. Actively creating space for all identities to be considered, discussed, and affirmed, not just those that deviate from the norm, is a key takeaway. It's about making the implicit explicit, and then making deliberate space for everyone's authentic self.
So if the old stage models are out, and even straight identity is kind of invisible or unexamined,
Yeah, where does that leave us?
what is truly happening with young people's sexual identities today? It seems like they're breaking all the molds and embracing something quite different, something more fluid and perhaps even unconstrained by traditional labels.
They absolutely are. The source highlights two major interconnected aspects of a modern youth experience regarding identity. First, there's the pervasive instability and inconsistency of sexual minority identity over time.
Instability and inconsistency.
And even more strikingly, there's an emerging trend towards no sexual identity at all, or at least a conscious refusal of traditional labels. Let's unpack the instability first.
Okay. What does it mean for sexual identity to be unstable over time? Does it mean attractions are changing or just the labels people use?
It means that youth themselves report their sexual identity is very much subject to change. They might perceive themselves as straight yesterday, bisexual today, gay lesbian tomorrow.
Wow, really shifting day to day sometimes.
Especially during the dynamic periods of adolescence and young adulthood. This isn't just anecdotal. Retrospective studies strongly support this. For example, Rosario and colleagues in 1996 found that nearly two-thirds of individuals who currently identified as gay, lesbian, or bisexual had previously identified differently at an earlier point in their lives.
That's a significant number, two-thirds. It really challenges the idea of a fixed, lifelong identity found early on.
It does. A later study by Kinnish and colleagues in 2005, which looked at individuals aged 36 to 60, corroborated this.
What did they find?
They found that many sexual minorities, but notably very few heterosexuals, had changed their identity label over time.
Ah, so it's more common for sexual minorities.
Yes. Women were more likely to change their labels than men, and bisexual individuals were more likely than those identifying as exclusively gay or lesbian to shift their self-identification.
Interesting gender and orientation differences there.
For instance, only about one-third of individuals who currently identified as lesbian had always identified as lesbian throughout their lives.
Only a third. Wow.
And over half of individuals who currently identified as bisexual had, at one point, identified as heterosexual.
So lots of movement between labels. And Diamond's longitudinal study in 2008 also powerfully supports this idea of shifting labels, right?
Yes. Diamond's groundbreaking longitudinal study, which followed young women over a 10-year period, found that nearly two-thirds of them changed their identity labels at least once.
Two-thirds again. Consistent finding.
Often, these changes occurred precisely because the existing categories or labels simply didn't adequately capture their diverse and evolving feelings and attractions.
But the boxes didn't fit.
Exactly. What's critically important here, and what the source highlights, is that while these labels shifted, the young women's sexual attractions remained relatively unchanged.
Okay, that's huge.
Yeah.
Labels change, attraction stays stable.
Yes. So a young woman might change her identity from, say, bisexual to heterosexual to unlabeled without a comparable fundamental change in her underlying patterns of attraction. The labels were a way of making sense of or navigating their attractions, not a fixed descriptor of the attractions themselves.
So this isn't just about identity being fluid, but also its inconsistency with other components like attraction and behavior.
Right. The pieces don't always align.
What does the data tell us about these disconnects?
The results are quite striking and challenge the common assumption that these components neatly align. For instance, the source cites a major U.S. study by Lauman and colleagues in 1994, which found that only about 20% of U.S. adults who are same-sex oriented on one component, whether it's identity, attraction, or behavior, also reported being same-sex oriented on the other two.
Only 20% alignment across all three. That's remarkably low.
It indicates a significant disconnect for a large majority of individuals.
So, for example, someone might feel attraction to one sex, behave sexually with another, and identify in a third way, or they might feel same-sex attraction but never act on it and still identify as straight.
Exactly. All sorts of combinations are possible. The Minnesota Junior and Senior High study by Rema Fidi and colleagues in 1992 is particularly illuminating for youth.
What did that show?
It found that adolescents who reported same-sex fantasies, attractions, or behaviors seldom identified themselves as sexual minorities.
Really? Even with those experiences?
Often, a striking three-quarters of adolescents who reported some form of same-sex experience actually identified as straight.
Three-quarters. Wow.
And in Switzerland, a 2003 study by Naring and colleagues found that 73% of adolescent girls who reported experiencing same-sex attraction still identified as heterosexual.
So the label doesn't automatically follow the feeling?
Not at all. This means that if you're a teacher, you cannot simply infer a student's identity from their attractions or behaviors. The internal label might be something else entirely.
This is truly fascinating and deeply important, especially for you, the elementary educator.
Crucial implications for the classroom.
It means that what a student tells you they are today might not be what they say tomorrow. And crucially, what they do or feel might not align with any traditional label at all.
Right.
If a student is in a relationship with someone of the opposite sex, you cannot assume they identify as straight. Or if they talk about being attracted to the same sex, you cannot assume they identify as gay or lesbian.
No assumptions.
So what does this pervasive fluidity mean for understanding young people, and what concepts are emerging to describe it?
What's truly fascinating here is how this empirical data fundamentally challenges the very notion of a fixed, static identity, particularly for sexual minorities. Concepts like sexual fluidity, a term popularized by Diamond in 2003 and 2008, and erotic plasticity, introduced by Baumeister in 2000, are being actively used by researchers to describe this dynamic, changeable nature of sexual expression and attraction.
Fluidity and plasticity. Okay.
For you, the elementary education major, this emphasizes the profound importance of not imposing labels on students.
Let them define themselves or not.
Exactly. It's about creating a safe, open space where young people can explore and change their self-understanding without judgment, without pressure to pick a side, and without the expectation that their current self-description is their final one. It's about supporting their journey, not defining it for them prematurely.
Building on that, the source proposes an even more radical and contemporary idea: the growing trend of no sexual identity at all.
Right, opting out completely.
With youth actively refusing traditional labels. This isn't just about fluidity within existing categories. It's a conscious rejection of the whole categorizing process itself.
It absolutely is. The source argues that current cohorts of youth, regardless of their underlying orientation, are increasingly eliminating the need to label their sexual identity or actively preferring non-traditional, often self-created terms.
We're just done with the labels.
Seems like it for many. The author illustrates this with powerful, direct quotes from youth participants in a 2009 workshop. For example, a 16-year-old male unequivocally wrote, "I don't desire to identify my sexuality. I just am me. Get over it."
Wow. That's a remarkably strong and direct statement, full of self-possession. It's a clear boundary.
It speaks volumes about a generation that seems less interested in being neatly categorized. Another 18-year-old young woman wrote with equal clarity, "I like what I like regardless of what's down their pants. If someone's attractive, they're attractive. The end."
Just focused on the person, not the category.
Precisely. This encapsulates a focus on individual attraction rather than societal categories. And another 18-year-old young woman described herself using a more specific but still expansive term, pansexual.
Pansexual.
She said, "I like gender blenders, the mixtures, the people that look like both boys and girls." Then it's a special surprise inside when you discover them in a sexual situation.
So they're either creating their own nuanced language or just opting out of labels altogether, viewing them as restrictive.
Exactly. A 17-year-old young man in the workshop even expressed it this way. "I guess I'm straight but curious because maybe I haven't met the right guy yet. Right now, straight but open to possibilities."
Leaving the door open, refusing a final definition.
Right. The source notes that it's not that today's youth can't name their sexual orientation in traditional terms, rather they simply don't feel the need to. The imperative to define themselves with a single, fixed label is diminishing.
So what are the underlying reasons behind this emerging trend? Why are these traditional labels suddenly feeling so limiting or irrelevant for so many young people?
For these youth, the traditional labels feel limiting, inadequate, confusing, and even, as the source puts it, misplaced.
Like they just don't fit reality.
Right. They perceive these labels as balkanizing sexuality, essentially, dividing it into rigid, often artificial, and sometimes conflicting groups. They are actively rejecting the identity boxes that adults in society have historically imposed.
Pushing back against the boxes.
Instead, for this cohort, sexuality is increasingly viewed simply as a matter of personal pleasure, happiness, and authentic connection, rather than a political statement or a strict categorization that defines their entire being.
Less politics, more personal experience. And this trend isn't just among young women anymore, is it? Historically, conversations about sexual fluidity were often associated more with female sexuality.
That's a crucial observation. While young women have indeed long been more likely to allow inconsistencies in their identity and create their own, more expansive labels, as Russ noted in 2000, often making sense of their desires through new notions of sexuality. The source indicates that young men are also increasingly refusing to engage in what they see as sexual identity politics. Green, in 1998, observed that adolescents of both sexes simply wanted the freedom to love and have sex with whom they desired, regardless of biological sex.
It sounds like a generational shift. A rejection of older generations' struggles to define and claim identity in favor of simply being without the need for a capital L label.
That's a very perceptive way to put it. Dixit, writing in Rolling Stone in 2001, observed that same-sex attracted college men no longer felt that identifying as gay was necessarily a primary or defining aspect of their personal identity.
Interesting.
One student succinctly remarked, "There's a prevailing attitude of, because I'm gay doesn't mean that's my life. I'm not a gay person. I'm a person who happens to be gay."
Just one part of them, not the whole story.
Exactly. For these young adults, their sexuality didn't have to be their sole or even primary defining characteristic. It was simply an aspect of who they are.
So, What large-scale societal and cultural shifts have contributed to this profound development in how youth are approaching their sexual identities? This isn't just happening in a vacuum.
The source points to two noteworthy and interconnected possibilities. First, there's been an undeniable and significant increased visibility and prevalence of same-sex sexuality in mainstream culture.
It's just more out there now.
Exactly. As same-sex sexuality has become more common, more openly discussed, and more visibly integrated among today's youth cohort, young people may feel that a distinctive, separate sexual identity label simply adds little significance to their overall personal identity.
Because it's less remarkable, less other.
Perhaps. In this sense, they are subtly becoming more similar to their other sex-oriented peers, for whom a sexual identity label is often unexamined.
And this isn't just anecdotal, it's clearly supported by broader societal changes in attitudes and acceptance, right?
Absolutely. The source cites compelling national poll data from Campo Flores in 2008, indicating that attitudes toward sexual minorities have become strikingly more positive and accepting over the past 2 decades.
The trend is clear.
A clear majority of Americans now support fundamental rights for sexual minorities, and these proportions are significantly more progressive among younger cohorts. For instance, as reported by Steinhauser in 2009, a remarkable 58% of 18 to 34-year-olds supported same-sex marriage,
Over half.
compared to just 24% of those 65 and older. This profound secular trend is partly because more people know a sexual minority individual personally. Today, nearly 3/4 of Americans report knowing someone who is gay or lesbian.
Contact breeds understanding.
Increased contact fosters increased understanding.
And among adolescents and young adults specifically, the attitudes are even more overwhelmingly positive, pushing this trend further.
Yes, high school seniors and college freshmen consistently show over 60% endorsement for same-sex marriage and general acceptance. This cultural shift is also profoundly attributable to the proliferation of gay-straight alliances, GSAs, in schools.
Right, GSAs make a difference.
With over 4,000 GSAs now established in U.S. secondary schools, these groups create more inclusive and supportive environments, normalizing diverse identities within school walls.
Plus media representation.
Huge factor. Additionally, the frequent and often casual portrayal of same-sex desire and relationships in youth-oriented online content, television shows, and films has played a huge role.
Yeah.
As Doig noted in 2007, homosexuality went from being largely invisible to shockingly visible to fairly pedestrian.
Just
Normal life.
the culture of contemporary teenagers has evolved to easily incorporate its homoerotic members. It's more than just being gay-friendly. It's in some ways about being gay-blind, meaning it's just another unremarkable aspect of identity. That's a huge, almost unthinkable cultural shift from even a generation ago. What's the second significant factor contributing to this widespread development?
The second powerful liberalizing factor is the public's growing belief that sexual orientation is innate and unchosen.
The born this way idea.
It's essentially, yes.
Yeah.
30 years ago, only about 1 in 10 U.S. citizens believed an individual was born gay. Today, more than 4 in 10 agree with that view.
That's a massive shift in belief.
This belief matters enormously because those who hold strong anti-gay attitudes tend to view homosexuality as a choice or something temporary and therefore alterable or even morally wrong.
Right.
As more and more people come to believe that sexual orientation is an unchosen innate characteristic, anti-gay attitudes tend to decrease significantly, fostering a more accepting social climate where young people feel less pressure to conform or conceal.
Now, the source does offer an interesting counter-argument to this secular trend hypothesis, suggesting there might be a historical research bias at play here.
Yes, that's an important methodological consideration. This counter-argument suggests that previous scholars might have overestimated the prevalence and importance of a singular, fixed sexual identity among sexual minority youth,
How so?
because they primarily included youth who already had a strong, defined sense of their sexual identity in their research.
Selection bias. They only studied the ones who did have a strong label.
Exactly. Essentially, if you only study youth who actively identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, you inadvertently miss the much larger population of young people who experience same-sex attractions or engage in same-sex behaviors but don't identify with those specific labels.
Leaving out a big piece of the puzzle.
Right. This creates a skewed understanding of the overall youth experience.
And the data seems to support this idea of sampling bias in earlier studies.
Absolutely. A Massachusetts high school survey in 1998 found that just over 2% of students identified as gay, lesbian, or bisexual.
Okay, 2%.
Yet a national study a few years later of the same age group found over 3 times as many reported same-sex romantic attractions, even though identity wasn't explicitly assessed.
So way more attraction than identification.
Yes. The source points out that crucial differences, like suicide attempt rates, dramatically differed between these groups: 35% for self-identified sexual minorities versus a much lower 13% for same-sex attracted youth who didn't identify as such.
Huge difference in risk. There are different groups.
This strongly suggests they were very different populations. This means that how the research population is sampled, whether by identity or by other aspects of orientation like attraction or behavior, significantly impacts and potentially distorts the research findings, giving an incomplete picture of youth experience.
This is perhaps the most direct and impactful takeaway for you, the elementary education major.
Definitely brings it home for educators.
It provides a truly contemporary, nuanced understanding of youth identity. As a teacher, this means you should embrace a fluid, individualized understanding of identity in your classroom.
It's the core message.
This isn't just a theoretical concept. It means actively creating spaces where students feel completely safe to express themselves in complex, evolving, or even unlabeled ways.
It truly does.
Yeah.
It means consciously avoiding assumptions about students based on their appearance, their friendships, or their expressed behaviors.
No jumping to conclusions.
It means understanding that trying to force traditional labels or categories onto students might actually alienate them because they see those labels as limiting or inadequate for their own evolving sense of self.
Respect their resistance to labels.
And it means actively building on the increased acceptance and visibility of diverse identities that already exist within youth culture itself, leveraging that openness in your classroom.
Meet them where they are.
This raises an important question for us as educators. If youth are actively resisting traditional labels, how do we, in our teaching practice, avoid inadvertently imposing old frameworks or expectations on them?
How do we adapt?
It shifts our role from trying to identify a type of student to simply accepting and supporting them as unique individuals, whatever their evolving sense of self may be. It's about meeting them precisely where they are in their journey.
Wow, what an incredible deep dive we've taken.
It really covered a lot of ground.
We started this conversation trying to pin down what seemed like straightforward definitions, and we ended up realizing that identity itself is a far more dynamic, fluid, and often unexamined moving target, especially for young people navigating today's rapidly changing world.
It's been a truly fascinating exploration, highlighting the dynamic and personal nature of self-understanding that youth are embracing.
Absolutely. To recap some of our key themes that are so relevant to your work. We first unpack the crucial distinctions between sexual identity, which is self-assigned and deeply personal.
Right, the meaning they make.
Sexual orientation label, which is a descriptive term for a predisposition.
Like heterosexual or bisexual.
And sexual orientation itself, which is a deeper, often unchosen attraction. We saw why conflating these terms causes so many misunderstandings.
Then we rigorously examine the limitations of rigid stage models like CASs, discovering why their linear, universal progressions simply don't fully capture the complex, often nonlinear, real-life experiences of young people. The empirical evidence doesn't support them, calling for a much more nuanced approach to development.
And that led us to the power of the differential developmental trajectories framework,
A much better fit for reality.
which truly emphasizes the unique, diverse, and often surprisingly similar experiences of all adolescents, regardless of sexual orientation. It's a call for individual understanding and support in the classroom, recognizing both commonalities and unique challenges.
We also dove into the fascinating and often overlooked invisible nature of straight sexual identity,
The paradox.
exploring how heteronormativity, the assumed default of heterosexuality, profoundly shapes our societal assumptions and privileges, a dominant identity that often goes unexamined by those who hold it.
And finally, we explored the growing, vibrant trend among modern youth to embrace fluidity, actively reject traditional labels, and define their own complex sexualities.
The move beyond boxes.
This trend, powerfully bolstered by increased societal acceptance and visibility of diverse identities, suggests a future where rigid identity boxes may be increasingly irrelevant for young people.
If we connect this to the bigger picture for you, as someone building a career in elementary education and newly exploring psychology, this deep dive really underscores that knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and applied flexibly.
Flexibility is key.
It means approaching every single student you encounter with profound curiosity, genuine openness, and a readiness to learn from them about their evolving self, rather than trying to fit them into predefined boxes or stages.
It's about fostering an educational environment where every young person feels seen, feels understood, and feels profoundly supported in their unique journey of self-discovery, whatever their identity may be, or even if they choose no identity label at all.
Exactly. So for you to mull over, if the very concept of sexual identity is becoming less relevant for contemporary youth and they're simply striving to be themselves in a fluid, authentic way, what implications does this have for how schools and society should foster belonging and well-being for all young people without relying on labels at all? What does a truly inclusive future look like if labels recede in importance?